Hello, and welcome back to Chords and Queens, the podcast dedicated to celebrating and amplifying the extraordinary work of female classical composers and musicians throughout history. I'm your host, Jennifer Athen, and I created this show because these remarkable women deserve to be heard, studied, and celebrated. Each episode will explore the lives, music, and lasting impact of the women who shaped the world of classical music. On today's episode, we have Errollyn Wallen. I've been aboard the Errollyn Wallen train ever since I picked up her autobiography. Wait, I've got it here. Becoming a Composer. And let me tell you, it's a ride I don't want to get off. What I appreciate most about her is how she wants to make composition accessible. As she writes in her book, "Since becoming a professional composer, I have longed to demystify the act of composing. And I personally think it's wonderful that a modern composer at the top of her game is so open to sharing her experience with everyone. Whether you're an experienced musician, to casual music fans, to really wanting to get into composition, this book is for everyone, even if you've never listened to a piece of classical music in your life. I really recommend this just as a book. It's fascinating. And she definitely achieves this goal of demystifying the compositional classical musical world. Not only in the book, but just her life. And she has loads of interviews of her demystifying the process of making music. And what's been so refreshing about researching Errollyn's life, compared to maybe other classical composers, for example, is that, well, first, she's still alive and actively creating. And that means there are interviews, new works, and resources always available. And these are things that unfortunately don't always exist when studying female composers from centuries past. Usually I enjoy the mystery and hunt for scraps of information, but this has been a really welcome and refreshing change, if I'm honest. In talking about creating new work, for example, at the time of recording this, Errollyn has just debuted a brand new piece called The Elements at this year's BBC Proms. So if you want an introduction to her music, that's a really great place to start. So to wrap up this introduction, I wanted to let you know I wanted to do this episode justice and offer a snippet into the life and work of Errollyn Wallen. I also really encourage you to read her book for yourself and listen to her music in order to get the full experience. Because I really believe whether you're a casual listener, a devoted fan, or someone who's never heard her name before, just 5 minutes with her music, I promise you, it will leave you wanting more. By really researching and listening to her work with my sort of critical ear on, it's made me realize how lucky I am to witness a great composer living out her life and creating new music. Because let's be honest, they'll be talking about Errollyn Wallen for years to come. So what a privilege it is to live alongside her in this moment. Now let's jump right in and start at the beginning. So Errollyn was born on April 10th, 1958 in Belize. When she was 2, she moved to London into the care of her aunt and uncle while her parents moved to New York. And throughout her childhood though, Errollyn endured constant criticism, being called stupid, lazy, told she wouldn't amount to anything. And her role in this household was to look after her aunt and uncle through daily chores, cooking and cleaning, while also caring for her younger siblings. She documents these experiences with just visceral honesty in her book, as she writes. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who was forced to make her own way in life from an early age. Her mother gave her up to an aunt and uncle living in England and went to live with her husband, the little girl's father, in New York. The little girl learned to feel the emotional demands of 4 adults who behaved like noisy toddlers one minute and then would suddenly become very strict and beat the little girl the next. The grown-ups told the little girl that she was stupid, lazy, slovenly, and ugly, and that she would never amount to anything. She would certainly never get married or have children. Her job was to look after them, make breakfast, clean the stove before school, fetch tea and coffee, clean the floor, wash the dishes, do the laundry, pick up all the bits from the carpet, look after her younger siblings, and never ever answer back. Children should be seen and not heard, is what her uncle would say. So there's a lot of heavy stuff that's happening in her childhood, and I respect her trust so much with the readers to share such intimate details about her childhood. And this honestly will help so many people, whether they're composers or not, feel less alone, I'm sure. If you've ever experienced similar negativity and had your childhood spirit crushed, here's an incredibly talented artist who made it through that and acknowledges it, all while building a successful life for herself. But on a bit of a brighter note, there's also a beautiful moment she shares. At age 9, walking down the street with her uncle, she confides that she hears melodies and sounds playing in her head. He tells her that she might be a composer, and it's probably most likely the first time little Errollyn has ever heard that term, and it's a powerful moment that's obviously stayed with her because she talks about it in the book. From childhood, Errollyn was obsessed with music, learning to dance, humming her own melodies, dreaming of becoming an opera singer, playing piano. She writes about composing always being within her, though she couldn't always think of a name for it or define it as wanting to be a composer. In the 1970s, she actually trained as a dancer in London at the Maureen Leon School of Dance and then at Yourdang Academy. She even moved to New York City to continue training at the Dance Theatre of Harlem in 1976. Eventually, though, she left dance to pursue composition, studying music at Goldsmiths College in 1981, then composition at King's College London in 1983, and earning her postgrad degree at King's College, Cambridge. During the 1980s, she wrote significant chamber works including We Four Kings in 1981 for alto sax, harpsichord, piano and double bass, and Mythologies in 1988 for violin, cello, clarinet, sax, piano and percussion. This woman can really churn out music, so I really recommend looking into more of her vast pool of early works. The 1990s brought one of the most interesting stories, as her time as a keyboard player for the girl group Eternal. While still composing classical music, she had a side job, as many musicians do, and Errollyn details her appearance on Top of the Pops as one of her quote-unquote I made it moments. And for those unfamiliar, Top of the Pops was a cult classic sort of British music TV show. Think MTV in America. I think that would be its closest relation. And Top of the Pops first broadcast by the BBC in 1964, and it became one of the most iconic music shows worldwide, running for over 40 years until 2006. So being on this show was a big deal for her, especially coming from a non-showbiz family. However, when she returned to her flat after filming the performance, she ran into her neighbours who were thrilled by their sudden brush with a celebrity. But she recalled that that moment lacked the excitement she'd imagined. What should have felt like a breakthrough instead became a turning point. She realised her quote-unquote success came from performing other people's songs, playing in support of someone else's vision. That revelation proved pretty decisive for her, and it was the last time she ever appeared as another artist's keyboard player. Back to her classical endeavours, and one of her breakthrough moments came with her first orchestral composition in 1994. This percussion concerto, written for Scottish musician Colin Currie, was performed during the finals of BBC Young Musician of the Year. The work was later performed at the 1998 BBC Proms, marking a huge milestone as Errollyn became the first black female composer featured at the Proms. And let's pause and consider that. The BBC Proms has been running for 130 years, and it was only in 1998, a mere 27 years ago, that they featured a composition by a black woman. And that's extraordinary that it took so long, but what an achievement for her. Her race and gender often come up in interviews, and her response always strikes me as very logical. In a 2024 BBC interview, she said, "Quite a few people, including friends, said, 'Why don't you write about how hard it is being a woman, how hard it is being black?' But I don't want to be restricted. I want to write about the subjects I want to write about in my own way." And I really respect this outlook, focusing not on who she is as a person, but on the music contained within her. It's often a complicated struggle with terms like female composer, because at the end of the day, they're just composers and people that write music. Your gender has very little to do with the actual process of writing the music. But I also acknowledge the lack of representation in the musical landscape, and sometimes highlighting someone's identity is an act of defiance against centuries of exclusion. Ultimately, the end goal is having works played, commissioned, and programmed by composers from diverse backgrounds. As she says, all that matters is the music you're writing. The 2000s and 2010s saw Errollyn's artistic vision reach full maturity. Her output during this period is staggering in both quantity and quality. These include symphonies, ballets, chamber music, vocal works, and an innovative consecutive series of operas. Two works in particular stand out as significant. Her contributions to the 2012 London Paralympic Games, including Spirit in Motion, performed by Denise Lee and Deepa Shastri at the opening ceremony, showcased her music to a global audience of millions. Spirit in Motion demonstrates everything special about Errollyn's music. It is simultaneously deeply personal and universally accessible, rooted in very classical tradition but speaking in a thoroughly contemporary voice. Around the same time, she was working on ambitious projects like her violin concerto, highlighting her mastery of traditional forms while maintaining her distinctive voice. But perhaps most significant is her continued work in opera. By this point, she had composed 22 operas, which is an extraordinary achievement, placing her amongst the most prolific opera composers of her generation. She openly discusses the compositional process of writing the opera Dido's Ghost in her book, and it's fascinating. She talks about ideas that fester in your brain throughout your whole life, something I'm sure many of us experience and still relate to, whether you're a composer or not. And for Errollyn, it brought back memories of learning Latin in school in East Sussex, obsessed with stories from Ovid's Metamorphoses and the story of Dido and Aeneas. In particular, the opera that Purcell wrote. She talks about being really obsessed with and finding so much comfort within the music. Dido's Ghost is her 20th opera, and it came about when she was asked to write a companion piece to Purcell's Dido and Aeneas. She worked with novelist and songwriter Wesley Stace as the librettist and director Frederick Wake Walker, and over 10 years they pitched the project before the Barbicans' Paul Keane finally said yes in December 2019. Then, you guessed it, COVID hit, and Errollyn composed the majority of the work from her lighthouse home in northern Scotland, which is an image that could be its own opera story in itself, honestly. What's fascinating about her discussion of this work isn't just necessarily the music, which unfortunately isn't readily available online, I don't think, or I haven't been able to find it. But what fascinates me more is her discussion about its process. She talks about finding inspiration in childhood memories while also revealing the mundane reality of being a working composer. It's not analysing every note until it's perfect. It's messy and boring and sometimes really frustrating. And when work is completed, you don't always feel relief, but an emptiness, a blurring rather than a clarity. Let me read you an excerpt. I find it useful to remember the physical situation of composing the work. This situation might seem haphazard to some, but is also basic and in every sense undressed, involving, as it does, whole days spent lounging about the lighthouse in pajamas and dressing gown. I force myself to remember the feelings of struggle, boredom, and restlessness that accompany the experience of thinking deeply about every aspect of making an opera. I remind myself that although I have pushed through the pain barrier and got to the finish line of the first performance, it does not guarantee that the work is any good. The end of the first struggle merely marks the beginning of the next, the journey of Dido's ghost into this world. Which is a pretty fascinating thing to uncover about a composer's journey through writing a certain piece of work. And she also admits to waking up at 5 a.m. every day just to orchestrate the work in just 3 weeks leading up to the performance, with admin falling by the wayside, and she brings humanity to the often foggy world of composition, and I really love that about her. And this is another excerpt from the book that I really liked. I think I'm happiest when I'm trying something new and making life difficult for myself. I relish composing instrumental music, but I do have an innate dramatic instinct, and what I love about composing operas is that this collaborative form combines every artistic and technical skill. Composing an opera forces a composer to dig deeply into so many areas of life's experience outside one's immediate knowledge. And did it all start with those large square placemats on our dinner table at 74 Seymour Avenue? Each mat had a different scene from Carmen. I remember their lurid orange-red hue, and the matadors and the dancing women dressed in billowing white blouses and brightly coloured skirts. Opera. I didn't really know what opera was then, but as a little girl there were several months when I hurled my warbling self around the house, imagining I was an opera singer. Little did I know that I would compose 22 operas and counting. And I love that imagery, and again, just like the demystifying of someone creating an opera, which we don't always get to see. We just see the final piece of work. We don't see what goes into it and what inspires it and what leads a composer to maybe make some of the decisions that they're making. So such a fascinating read about what I'm sure is a very wonderful piece, although I've never seen it and I'm still mad about not seeing it. If you ever bring it back, I will be there. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite bodies of work. Her album Photography, featuring her ensemble, Ensemble X. And this was Errollyn's first album of purely orchestral works, offering a compelling exploration of her orchestral voice while blending minimalism, baroque counterpoint, and lush romantic textures. The cello concerto exemplifies the album's overall sound. It's haunting and contemplative, themes you find throughout Errollyn's work. She has a real knack for making string instruments replicate the human voice, manipulating them to sound like they're speaking words to you. And my favorite piece on the album, and actually one of my favorite pieces of all time probably, is Photography 3. And I discussed this on last week's podcast about haunting music. And it's such a short piece, but it packs in so much. Starting out really gentle and elegant, and it descends into this sort of gorgeous madness. It's contemporary music that feels legendary and that it's been around forever. And like I said, this is one of my favorite classical albums, so I really recommend having listened to it. But she's also made more traditional, how I describe probably jazz songwriter albums as well, like Meet Me at Harold Moore's, which is, if you like the artist Leve, I really hope I'm saying that right. I've watched too many interviews of hers not to be able to pronounce that name. But if you like her, I really think you'll love Meet Me at Harold Moore's. And it's just such a different side of Errollyn. They feel like two different artists to me, like her classical side and that more jazz contemporary. And it really will just solidify to you that what a talented and multifaceted artist Errollyn is. And it's probably because of that undeniable talent that in 2020, Errollyn's contributions were recognized when she was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, or a CBE for short. And what's remarkable about this period is how she continues evolving as an artist, never settling into a comfortable repetition. Then came 2024, the year Errollyn Wallen achieved one of the highest honours in British music. In August, King Charles III appointed her Master of the King's Music, making her the first black woman to hold this position. Now, this role dates back centuries, and previous holders include Edward Elgar, William Boyce, Arnold Bax, and most recently, the legendary Dame Judith Veer, who was actually the first woman in this position. And when announced, Errollyn said, "I am thrilled to accept this royal appointment. It will be a privilege and great honour to serve His Majesty the King, the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. I look forward to championing music and music making for all." And that final phrase, music making for all, encapsulates Errollyn's entire artistic approach, in my opinion. She's never been interested in music as an elite pursuit, accessible only to those with the right background. And throughout her career, she's worked to break down barriers, whether she's known it or not, making classical music welcoming to everyone simply by being herself and pursuing her passions. And I hope that the appointment recognizes not just individual achievement, but the changing face of British music itself, signaling that excellence comes in many forms and from many backgrounds. Now, let's discuss something that might not be for everyone, but is certainly for me, and that is her style. This woman has taste. She dedicates a chapter in her book to bowing clothes, which I adore. She mentions enjoying life in the background where composers usually live, unless performing their own music, of course. However, she is known for making some striking fashion choices when she's not backstage. And in her book, she talks about how her early years with a chiropodist uncle meant sensible shoes, while deep down she maybe envied the shiny patent leather ones that other kids wore, which she talks about definitely making up for this in her 20s and 30s, squashing her feet into all sorts of funky, gorgeous, and fashionable shoes. And I love that she also describes and details different quote-unquote composer uniforms. She often talks about starting compositions in nightwear, who hasn't been there, wearing relaxed but purposeful attire for rehearsals, and then considering the bowing clothes for premieres. And she talks about this being quite a nice distraction from the work itself, like choosing what to wear to take your bow. She loves color, texture, and shape, and admiring designers like Vivienne Westwood and Junya Watanabe. Now, one of my favorite sentences in the book is actually this, because she writes, "I hadn't yet read that the wearing of copious amounts of silk for both composing and bowing did Liszt and Wagner absolutely no harm," which I love that she acknowledges. When Errollyn isn't composing or looking chic, she's sharing knowledge with the next generation. And as I've talked about and referenced ad nauseum in this podcast, in 2023 she published the book Becoming a Composer through Faber. And the book is a memoir that's also a guide for aspiring musicians. And I highly, highly recommend this book as it demystifies the composer's life, giving an honest look at what that means day to day for someone who's making music as a profession. And it's honest. She talks about it isn't always glamorous. It can be ugly and tiring and isolating, but you can find simple pleasures and make the greatest friends among musicians, directors, and the writers that you work with. To me, it's one of the best composer biographies I've ever read. And actually, I'll go even further to say it's probably my favorite biography I've read thus far. It's so disarming, and it's not a step-by-step, on this day I wrote this phrase. It weaves in and out of her entire life, telling stories you would hear from an old friend, and I'm in love with it. And speaking of things I love, one of my most favorite things that I learned about her in the book isn't that she's a ridiculously hard worker and fashion icon. And actually, it has nothing to do with melody, harmony, or music composition either. It's that Errollyn Wallen eats cake for breakfast. And as someone with a serious sweet tooth, that revelation spoke directly to me and made me feel seen and encouraged me to eat cake for breakfast. Which, is that a good thing? I don't care. If Errollyn Wallen does it, I'm gonna do it. As we conclude our exploration of Errollyn Wallen's remarkable journey, consider what her career tells us about classical music's future. Errollyn has proven that excellence and accessibility aren't mutually exclusive. Music can be sophisticated without being pretentious, experimental without being alienating, and diverse without sacrificing quality. Her appointment as Master of the King's Music is an important achievement. I hope it symbolizes how far British classical music has come in embracing diversity and recognizing talent wherever it emerges, but that it also acknowledges that there's still room to grow. Absolutely there is. But when kids are being taught about composers in the classroom, I hope they learn about the brilliant Errollyn Wallen and how her story shapes her music that she writes. Looking ahead, Errollyn continues composing, with new orchestral works being recorded at Abbey Road Studios and premieres scheduled worldwide. Her influence extends beyond her own compositions, and she's opened doors for composers who don't fit traditional molds, and her accessible approach has influenced a generation of artists and educators, I'm sure. From a 2-year-old born in Belize to the Master of the King's Music, Errollyn Wallen has shown us that music truly can be, as she puts it, for all. Her ensemble's motto reflects this perfectly. We don't break down barriers in music, we don't see any. Embodying Errollyn's free-spirited approach and eclectic musicianship. That's all, folks, but I hope you enjoyed this journey exploring the life and music of Errollyn Wallen. And if you enjoyed this and want to know more female composers, you can listen to more of the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, while you're at it, make sure to give us a follow on the Instagram and TikTok, where I post lots of little stories about female composers, and you can find that at Chords and Queens. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again soon.